make sure it's running. Okay. All right, so before we start, just a couple of key points. The paper is due next class period, so on Wednesday. Again, those of you that are physically here looking at me, if you could bring it in, that'd be great. If you can't, just email it to me, preferably to the Francis Marion email, because if it starts going to all my different emails, it'll be a pain in the butt to keep up with. Also, my Francis Marion email tends to get less spam than my personal email, so it'll be easier to keep up with. Obviously, for my online classes, you can just email it to me. If you want to come up here to the Continuum and like try to find me, or just give it to the lady at the front desk, that's cool too. Just bring it in anytime Wednesday. That's all I can think of. We might be finishing our notes on Wednesday as well. We're going to see how far we get through today. I'll be able to tell you at the end of class what we'll be doing on Wednesday. It's usually how we do. I don't think there's anything else. Any questions from anybody before we start? Yeah, you okay? You're making noises over there. Coffee is gross.
No, coffee is amazing.
Oh,
Just
well.
don't know how to make it. It's like a hit or miss with it. Every time.
Yeah, enjoy your bean water.
That's exactly what it is. You need water. They didn't even try to do anything like I want to do. They just put some creamer and a pump of caramel. And that's about what I said.
Okay. So this should be where we ended last time, at least when I look back over the video.
I always wondered how you knew where we left off.
Man, see, this is the thing, is that with the online classes, I can go back and look for this class. My other two classes, it's just like, I have to kind of remember. Which is why I ran out of class and like went and printed out my test for 103, because I remembered, oh wait, we were reviewing today in 103. So should probably be prepared to review in 103. So yeah, thankfully for this class, I can actually go back and check the video.
Because if it was me, I would not remember. Yeah, no.
It's harder when you have more than one of the same class and they're like in different points. Because like my Tuesday, Thursday, we're basically reviewing tomorrow. But here we're further back. So yeah.
So when is our next test?
It'll probably be next week.
Next week?
Yeah. Based on how far we are through this. I mean, we're on slide 3 of 23 right now. Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means we're just now starting this chapter. But, yeah. But we'll probably be close to the end by the end of class today. So we might be able to finish it off on Wednesday. And then we can do the study guide on Wednesday. Maybe. We'll see. Worst case scenario, we'll do the review next Monday. And then the test on Wednesday. But we'll see. Okay. So this is where we ended. We talked about the Battle of Bunker Hill. George Washington needing to lead the armies, but since the Continental Congress wasn't really a government, he had to rely on volunteers. And as I said, Washington wasn't exactly like this great general. He was just good at keeping people from leaving the army because they didn't have supplies. They did manage to capture Montreal, but they were not able to be reinforced, so the British kept a strong hold over Canada. There was a victory over Boston, thanks to General Henry Knox delivering weapons from Ticonderoga that had been captured by Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys. And this was the, well, there's Montgomery dying. Yeah, this is Washington and General Prescott setting up the cannons on the hills over Boston and just shelling it. Which, the thing about cannons is if you've got the high ground with cannons, you're going to win. Cannons aren't very good at shooting up. They're very good at lobbing downwards. They're very heavy. I mean, they do shoot at an arc, so you can like shoot up a hill, but if you're already up on the hill, you can shoot very far. And if you're shooting especially into a harbor and you're hitting ships, the British don't like when you hit their ships.
I wish I was around there with cannons on. I'd be shooting cannons at everybody.
Cannons are fun.
But like, how long does it take to like,
What's that?
how does it work? I don't know how cannons blow their work. I didn't take some now, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, actually, you have to put the powder charge in first, and you have to put like, it's usually like a wad of cotton or cloth between the powder charge and the ball, because the cannon is usually going to be hot, and you don't want to set off the charge before you put in the ball, because then it's going to explode. Yeah, that's why they have those big swabber things, because if there's sparks in there and you put in the powder, it's going to be a mess.
They need a team for that, so like it can go fast.
They do have teams. Yeah, it's usually like three or four man teams per cannon. Yeah, and then they have someone in the back to light the fuse once it's ready.
Okay, never mind. It's a little machine. I can do
It's
it.
a whole thing.
I want to be the person that like makes it go off.
Yeah, cannons are fun if they're working effectively, but if you start losing people in the crew, it starts becoming a mess.
Someone realizes that they can that they're about to blow up. That's so funny. Oh my god.
So, as the war began, there was immediately some fallout for some of the issues within the colonies. So Dunmore, he was the royal governor for Virginia, which is to say he was appointed by the British Parliament. He had been forced to flee by the Patriot forces, but he managed to rally enough loyalists and, get British military backing to at least form a resistance there in Virginia, and offered freedom for any slaves and white servants who agreed to fight for the British. And so many white servants and black slaves did quickly abandon their post and agree to fight for the British in exchange for freedom. Because obviously, so this caused a lot of trouble for the Patriot leadership, because, yeah, they wanted they're fighting for freedom, but big asterisk next to it, because they're fighting for freedom for themselves from like British taxation, not actual freedom from slavery. Because if they were doing that, the South certainly would not help in the war, and it was a major part of the economy, and also the whole social hierarchy. This wasn't like we would stop slavery, but we have to have the South fighting with this. It's like, no, this is part of the social hierarchy. This is how things were done, and they weren't trying to stop it. I mean, just about every one of the founding fathers owned slaves. George Washington had a plantation. Thomas Jefferson had a plantation. Now, again, as I mentioned, it wasn't like all the colonists were up in arms against the British, like you will often see in the very simplistic, like children's tales of then all the colonists fought against the British. A lot of the colonists were attempting to just negotiate with the British to try to stop the war before it got any worse. But Parliament prohibited any negotiation or trade with the colonies at all. So many who would have been neutral were like, well, I guess we just sort of have to join with the rebels because it's hard to be neutral. And in fact, there's a whole section here on neutrality. So we'll get to that in a minute. We also have Common Sense, which was written by Thomas Paine, 1776. Used a lot of arguments from both biblical stories and scientific analogies to push arguments for independence. And this wasn't just like some political highbrow speech that he made at Harvard or something. This was something that people that like the common man could read. Sold 120,000 copies in 3 months, which at a time when you didn't have much in terms of transportation, you certainly didn't have really fast printing presses. I showed you guys what the printing presses look like. You put the ink down by hand and then you press the thing. There you got a copy. Which it was easier to print pamphlets than it was books because you printed them a page at a time. The pamphlet was a page usually. It was used in taverns and coffee houses where people would just like chat and they would debate over the stuff in Common Sense. Yeah. I mean, I've actually got a picture of it here. It's just like a little thing here. Common Sense, addressed to the inhabitants of America, written by an Englishman, January 10th, 1776. Within weeks of it being printed, George Washington wrote to a friend of the sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning contained in Common Sense. This was really where the grassroots argument for independence started, because again, before it was like all the elites wanted it because it'd be good for their bottom line, it'd be good for the economy, or at least their economy. But for the common people, it didn't really matter. But with Common Sense, it was made to at least seem like it mattered to the common people. And it started pushing the common man to vote for control of the legislatures to push for independence. And this is when Congress sent an agent to France to request economic and military assistance. I know I asked my other class this, so I'm going to ask you guys. Does anybody know who that person was, who they sent to France to request economic and military assistance? He's a very famous founding father. He's well known for going to France very often. He went after the war. He was in France a lot. Was it Thomas Jefferson? He was well known for liking French women. Yes. Benjamin Franklin. We'll get into that more specifically later. I'm Just curious if anybody knew about old Ben Franklin.
And he ruled the king, right?
Yes. He did a lot of stuff. He was kind of a Renaissance man of the age. There's the train. Come right through the door. So, as more fighting is happening, the rationale of common sense is going through the people. So even the common man is pushing for independence. Even the moderate delegates of the Continental Congress are starting to believe independence was the way to go. So Thomas Jefferson, of course, is the one who began to write up the official declaration. And I should mention, especially if you read any of the documents around this time, the Declaration of Independence is not an original document. It's not something that Thomas Jefferson pulled out of the ether, something that was from his brilliant mind alone. It was from ideas that people from all over the world at the time, and indeed from that region at the time, had been using. Let's see. Let's see. Virginia Declaration of Rights, drafted by Mason in May of 1776, declaimed that all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights. John Locke argued sovereignty resided in the people, who submitted voluntarily to laws and authorities in exchange for protection of their life, liberty, and property. The people could therefore reconstitute or overthrow a government that abused its powers. So Jefferson was just very good at, I've mentioned there, yeah, summarizing this into a much smaller document. I mean, it's like a page or two long. Rather than it being like multiple different documents, he put it all together in one. So again, I'm not trying to shit on Jefferson, but unlike some weird nationalist cults right now, this wasn't literally written by God and handed down to Jefferson. It was written by a bunch of different people, and then Jefferson summarized it. So it would be easy and concise to just send to Britain. Be like, hey, this is what we're doing. I mean, John Locke was Scottish. We learned about him in my 103 class. And like the stuff he says is like, yeah, this sounds real familiar. If you've ever read any American documentation ever, because they took it from John Locke. So once he finished writing it, he brought it to the Congress, and they debated and revised the document. So it wasn't, again, not just like he did the thing and it was perfect and they all agreed on it. No, they tore it apart and reworked it, and they're people. They did state that the king had, quote, excited domestic insurrections among us in regard to Dunmore's threat of freeing the slaves. Also, I should mention that if you ever do read the Declaration of Independence, they always mention that the king did these things when it was like the parliament, because it sounds better to say, oh, we're resisting the king and the king's tyranny and all of this, rather than we don't like what Parliament is doing, because Parliament is a representative democracy. We just don't like how they're doing things, so we're going to make our own representative democracy. Now, granted, we didn't have representation in that representative democracy because we were a colony. But saying Parliament doesn't have quite as much oomph as saying the king, what am bad. So July 2nd, 1776, 12 colonies approved the Declaration. New York abstained because, well, in part because they were largely occupied by England. But also I guess they felt like maybe things could still be worked out. And then they waited for 2 days before they formally declared independence. Much like Bastille Day in France, which is the only day I celebrate in July. July 4th, nothing really was accomplished. It's like, hey, we're officially doing a thing. It's like, we've already been fighting for like months now. The only thing that is like a formal declaration. It's like, hey, by the way, we're actually doing this. It's like, okay, nothing was accomplished though. I don't know why we don't celebrate like when the treaty was signed at the end of the war, when the war was over. But whatever. So they published the Declaration as a broadside and circulated it throughout the colonies, which was technically treason. So now we done did a treason. So there's everybody doing the thing. So, as I mentioned, there's different sides to this war because, again, it's not just all loyal patriots versus the British soldiers that are coming over from England. So, before even the Declaration had been written, groups within the colonies were quickly making their stances plain. We had mentioned the white servants and black slaves of Virginia that worked with the British. They also realized that the natives were going to be important because they're still there in relatively large number, and they know the land better than anybody else. And I mean, even if the colonists had been living in that region for a few generations at this point, the natives still knew the land much better. So the British under Guy Johnson, I don't think it's Guy, it might be Guy, but that's French. Or the Mohawk tribe under Joseph Brant or Tyendingea. We'll talk more about Joseph Brant a little bit later. So the Continental Congress did work with some of the Oneida natives, thanks in part to Samuel Kirkland. You okay? But most of the Oneida natives wanted to remain neutral because they had seen what these wars tended to do to them. So if you don't know what a loyalist is, here's what a loyalist is. They're those that remain loyal to the British because, as I've said, an uprising in a British colony against the motherland isn't uncommon. It happened all the time. It happened like every 30 years in Ireland. I think it had happened by now in India. I don't know if it had happened I don't remember if it's happened in Australia. I need to look that up. But basically everywhere Britain's been and has like put down a colony, they've rebelled at some point. So like for the British who were living here, who were like, well, this will blow over. You know, they weren't ready to take up arms. So the Loyalists typically were able to hang out in large cities. New York, Newport, and Charleston tended to be places that were largely Loyalist, had the largest military presence. However, it wasn't just like rich merchants. You know, we talked about like the royalist elites before. There actually were a fair few like poor farmers who fought for the British because their wealthy landlords decided to fight for the colonies. Like, well, if my landlord's going to fight against the British, then I'm fighting for the British because I hate my landlord. I don't care about the whole British American thing. I'm just going to do whatever my landlord isn't doing. And again, with the native tribes, excuse me, many, like the Mohawk, Seneca, and Cayuga in the north, and the Cherokee and Creek in the south, which is weird that the Cherokee and the Creek were fighting. I don't know if they fought together, but they were at least both fighting on the side of the British. They fought on the side of the British because they knew that if the colonists won, or in this case, I guess the Americans now, it would result in further expansion in their lands, because the British had specifically drawn that proclamation line and said, okay, you guys can't go any further. And in part, this war is due to that. So they know that if the Americans win, they're going to start expanding west, which is definitely going to be the case. We're going to see this a couple of times going forward. But these civilians who were loyalists, who were pro-British, that were, in these cities, that were eventually taken by the Patriot forces, did face reprisals. When the Patriots moved in, they were an occupying force. They were an opposing military. You'll sometimes read stories about, oh, the British came into the town and murdered the women and children. Well, so did the Americans. So, it definitely goes both ways. There was no good side to this war. So, here you have basically looks like mountain folk fighting, can't tell whether that's, well, based on the hats, those are like Hessians. We'll talk about Hessians in a little bit. Now, some groups did try to remain neutral. As we said, the natives usually tried to stay neutral because they had seen what would happen if they got involved in the war. But it was hard to remain neutral because the Patriots tended to just murder them anyway. The Suwannee Chief Cornstalk was killed in 1777 under a flag of truce by American soldiers, because that's apparently something American soldiers are really good at, is murdering natives under a flag of truce, as we're going to see going forward. So, yeah, obviously, if one side is murdering your people, you're going to go to the other side? Try not to, please. And then the colonists who try to remain neutral tended to get the worst from both sides. Quakers, Mennonites, Amish, Shakers, which I think is just like a branch of the Quakers, and Moravians. I don't know some of these groups. Wanted to remain neutral out of moral and religious reasons. Tended to be fined for refusing to pledge allegiance to these state governments. For example, in June of 1778, 9 Mennonite farmers were jailed in Pennsylvania for refusing to take an oath of allegiance. Their property and assets were sold, which left their family destitute. So they didn't just go to jail for not joining the war. All their stuff was taken, and then their family was just left homeless. That seems a little extreme. It's like, hey, we're going to make an example of you by throwing you in jail. Okay, cool. Also, your family's now out in the cold. All right, that's a little much. The Quakers were like really serious on their neutrality though. So if you were caught helping one side or the other, they'd kick you out. Betsy Ross, for example, was a Quaker. She is famous for helping sewing flags for the rebellion, and her husband, who isn't named in the book, so he's Betsy Ross's husband. Cool. He actually joined the rebellion entirely. They were kicked out of the Society of Quakers. But hey, the Society of Quakers didn't jail them and take their crap, so, you know, I feel like there's a difference in you're not allowed to come to our churches anymore and you're going to jail and also we're taking your stuff and letting your children starve. Well, the Quakers are usually pretty cool. Which, again, we'll get to a little bit later. Anyway, here's the American soldiers peacefully greeting Chief Cornstalk. This is the Quaker lady detaining the English general. She's maybe getting them drunk while her friends are, we're going to see more of this in a little bit. Her friends are going around and getting some guns to come and take care of the British. And there's so one of the better images I was able to find of Betsy Ross, like not out of a children's coloring book. And meanwhile, we do have those that did push for independence. But with the formal declaration, actually fighting now was formal treason. So if the rebellion did fail, anyone who was actively rebelling would be tried as traitors. And, you know, if you were tried as a traitor, well, as Benjamin Franklin put it, we all have to hang together, otherwise we'll hang separately. So, yeah, things were a little more desperate now. And the families of those who were doing the fighting had their own work ahead of them. Some female patriots did travel with the armies to support them. Some did some fighting as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later, which is like probably my favorite part of this chapter. Most tended to stay home to support the war effort. Northern women did their best to increase cloth production because, you know, the boys need their uniforms, especially when they're camping in the snow. Washington, good work there, Valley Forge. Southern women attempted to increase crop production because, again, the boys got to eat. We do have one example here. Mary Fryer of Chester County, Pennsylvania. It's weird saying Chester County, not immediately saying South Carolina. Collected clothes and mended them if necessary before sending them to nearby troops. Like, she went around the town and basically, like, got people to donate clothes that they didn't need anymore and then brought them to whatever troops were nearby. Also, Phyllis Wheatley of Boston. She was a freed slave who had learned to read and write. She wrote poems to George Washington, urging him to recognize Africans as, quote, children of God, which, you know, worked really well because he freed his slaves. after he died. Um, there were some freed blacks that did work with the rebellion, though most remained enslaved in the South because, again, this is America. And those who had a choice tended to get the hell out and join the British. Because we're actually just a couple of decades off of the British ending the transatlantic slave trade. Anyway, here's your typical like colonial household. You've got the big ass hearth which takes up like one entire wall. You got the kids just like sitting in the middle of the room getting in trouble. Got the butter churner, the loom. You got what little bit of a kitchen there. Don't like the name of this book. G.J. Barker Benfield, maybe not the best title for a book there. Phyllis Wheatley Chooses Freedom. It's like, I mean, I get it. Like, she had been freed by the human being who owned her, a fellow human being, and then decided to continue working with the American Revolution. But she certainly didn't just decide, I don't feel like being a slave anymore. So I don't know if that's the best title for the book. I don't know. It's just me, maybe. Okay, on to the war. The British were beating the crap out of us. So, summer of 1776, as the war was now, I guess, officially on, even though it had been going for about a year now, Washington, after taking Boston, decided to pull his troops from Boston to attack the British in New York City. However, many of his men began to leave. And this goes back to something that we mentioned last chapter before, probably both. The Bostonian soldiers felt like the men of New York should defend New York, while the Bostonians didn't want to shed the blood for, a different colony. That's not their fight. There wasn't this, this overall American ideal yet. They were all still their own independent colonies. And really, even once we get to the Articles of Confederation, there's still this very independent state ideal, which isn't very strong. You got to work on that. So General Howe, after the Declaration of Independence, moved his troops in the Hudson River Valley to cut off New England and New York from the rest of the colonies, which, because New England and New York were two of the biggest areas, and then there's, Pennsylvania. Bless you. No, it's fine. I mean, I don't know how much dust might be in here because it's one of these big, weird rooms. So, the British had Hessians, who were German soldiers. Mentioned them earlier because I saw the pointed hats. Well, they were German mercenaries, essentially. We'll mention them at the end of the chapter as well. So they were paid to fight for the British. They were known to be, they're German, so they're very good fighters. I think in the original Tale of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman Sahestion? So in the Battle of Long Island, not only did the British troops have the Hessians, but Admiral Richard Howe had the British Navy, so the Continental forces were pushed back. By November, they had taken Fort Lee in New Jersey and also hit Fort Washington north of New York City. So they were expanding out from New York City, which again was like their main stronghold. And in fact, they had expanded so much that the Continental Congress fled from Philadelphia into Baltimore because they feared that Howe would march into Philadelphia. And if he takes the Continental Congress, then the independence movement doesn't really have a leadership anymore. Even if they're not like a strict, they're not really a strict leadership. That wasn't Howe's idea though. He wasn't planning on moving quickly and taking cities. He was simply planning on wearing down the army and having the colonies plead for peace, and he was trying to have it end as amicably as possible. There we go. Use your words. With how easy things had been so far, I guess he figured that there wasn't much fight in the colonies, so he was just going to grind the army down until they surrendered. And then the war would be over. He wouldn't have to hit cities, because hitting cities tends to breed resentment, ask the Irish, and causes more rebellions in the future. They tend to remember when you murder their civilians. So this was the campaign in New York. See here you have the British and Hessian troops moving against the Americans, pushing them out of Manhattan. There's the Hessians with their pointy hats and their mustaches. Oddly, they're actually in retreat here. Usually they're shown as being terrifying. Here they're actually being pushed back by the Patriot forces. Here we have the Battle of Fort Washington, and they pushed on to Fort Lee as well. The British, of course, if there's water nearby, the British have a ship, and then the ship rolls in and starts shooting into wherever they're at. Because if you're not aware, the ships tend to be loaded with cannons and can bombard the hell out of places. Nee, I think you'd like that.
Yes.
You roll up and just broadside a place. It's really good.
That sounds like so much fun. But like also, like,
The whole ship just rocks to the side.
it'd be fun to watch. I bet it's not fun for people on the ship.
Nah.
Like, how do you prepare for that?
You don't. You get down and hope that the piece of wood that you're behind is strong enough to at least deflect
Maybe.
the cannonball.
I mean, just think sounds fun, like the brew, that sounds like something. I watched the fly guy that you have, he froze. Yeah, I was
It's also why you get like on the real big ship of the line that's got like 4 decks of cannons,
okay, that makes,
and you're just like, you're a fortress, and the other ships don't even get near you.
I watched him use this and fail. Every system is valuable.
So things were not going well for the Continental Army. They not scored a single victory between July of 1776, which, you know, right before that was Boston, and December. So not going well. The year of 1776, not exactly great for the American forces. However, General Howe was certainly a European at heart. And in Europe, you tended to take the winters off. You would go back to your forts and you hang out. You'd do your best to resupply, you'd rearm, and that'd be, you know, you wouldn't really fight in the winter because fighting in the winter sucks. Which was good for the Continental forces because they were nearly ready to break. And when a military force breaks, that's usually it. That means the people scatter, the chain of command is gone, and the army's pretty much destroyed. It doesn't necessarily mean they're all dead, but they've left. And that's it for the fighting force. But they were able to regroup, you know, repair the equipment they had, recruit more forces to replace their losses. However, they were camping in eastern Pennsylvania in the winter in Valley Forge. Not a great place to camp. It's kind of cold, a lot of snow. This was before global warming, so it was still very cold. However, while there, they discovered that the Hessian troops were hanging out in Trenton, New Jersey, right across the Delaware River, right across from where they were. So he made a decision, which could have gotten him and all of his men killed, but it didn't, so we remember it today, as opposed to, so then Washington made a decision and he's a footnote now. He's got all his men killed, and now that's why we're still a British colony. So he and his boys crossed the Delaware River to hit the Hessian camp on Christmas Eve and routed the Hessian forces. And I'll show you the famous Washington crossing the Delaware picture and show you why it was such a bad idea. But we'll get to that in a moment. So after routing the Hessian forces, which again, it was Christmas Eve, so they were all probably drunk. It wasn't really a battle. It was more shooting drunk Germans. You know, heroism. They marched on Princeton, New Jersey, fought 3 regiments of British troops. Now again, regular British troops, that means like they were proper British troops. It's not regular like we use in everyday speak. They fought them for about a week, but they were defeated by January 3rd, and they pulled out of New Jersey entirely and settled back into New York, which again remained the stronghold until like the end of the war. But with New Jersey now returned as a buffer zone, Continental Congress returned to Philadelphia. Now, while this wasn't like a major victory in terms of strategic points were taken, this was really just a return to the status quo before Howe Howe and his men took all that stuff in New Jersey, it did show that the American forces had fight in them, and that this war was not going to be short and clean. And in particular for the British, it showed that this war was not going to be short and clean. But for the Americans, it showed, hey, maybe we can actually do something against the British. Maybe we aren't completely defenseless. Now, this is the famous Washington crossing the Delaware image. It's like 1 billion pixels long. It's extremely high resolution. But notice that there's less people paddling than there are people like fighting the ice flows. Because if you try to cross a river in the winter, especially in this time period, you were very likely to be crushed by ice. Like the ice would just crush your ship and you would die. And I very much doubt that there was some dude like dramatically holding an American flag in the background. I'm sure they were all doing this. Everybody, including Washington, was just like, nah.
They look so dramatic. Why are they just staring into the abyss?
Yeah. It's like, oh, we got to pose for the picture. It's like, no, we got to keep the ice from killing us, George. Which, worse than this, are the people back there
Slaving.
with the horses. Can you imagine being on a boat and there's just like ice rumbling and cracking around you, and there's horses freaking out on the boat?
Bro, how do they not drown?
I'm sure a few of them did.
Dude right there's got his foot on the iceberg.
Yeah.
And he's just like,
He's like, nope.
no iceberg.
If I let the general die, I'm going to be in so much trouble.
That's hilarious. That dude right there, he's stressing out. He's got his hand on his hat. He is stressing out.
Like, oh no, I don't want to die like this. Yeah, crossing icy rivers is not something you do. That's why the whole crossing the Delaware is seen as like a big deal. It's not just they crossed the river at nighttime and it was a surprise attack. It's because it was covered in ice. And every one of these pieces of ice could just smash the rocks like a Kit Kat bar. Or not the rocks, the boats. Yeah. Anyway, here they are after shooting some drunk Germans. This is after the Battle of Princeton, or during the Battle of Princeton. This is one of the weirder images I've got. I'm guessing this is after they crossed the line, because you've got cannons that are facing like behind where the Americans are. So I'm guessing this is like after the Americans have really crossed the battle lines into the British. You've got a British dude like stabbing a horse there. I don't know what's happening with that. I guess he was like going for the American soldier and he just like missed. The guy's like holding the bayonet like a badass. Dude over here got shanked.
Yeah, whacked.
I mean, that's proper bayonet use.
This probably were not funny when they came out.
No, very dramatic. I mean, again, dramatic. Here's Washington like leading the boys while guys over here are getting shanked.
It's like, look at the horsey.
Yeah, horse is like, well, I'm done.
Even though horse is dramatic. That's crazy.
Guy over here is just like, I'm not hurt, but I'm going to dramatically hold my drum.
It's so funny.
That is mine.
Yeah. They would have a combat look. No, not all the ones inside. Y'all have a lot like that.
A lot happening. So I like these images with a lot happening. Obviously, there's the stuff in the middle that you're supposed to pay attention to, but then you just start looking around. So the next year, the British and their native allies, decided that enough was enough. They couldn't just sit around and wait on the Americans to wear themselves out. So General Howe decided to do what the Continental Congress had feared he was going to do to begin with, and began moving towards Philadelphia. And his army was so much larger than Washington's. Washington could only really engage in delaying tactics. He could just hit Howe's army from the flanks and the side and the back, and just annoy him to slow him down. But he couldn't force a full engagement, or his forces would have been overrun. So there was no Washington versus Howe, army versus army fight, because Howe's army was so much bigger. Now, while this was going on, and this is going to be the much more important thing, General Burgoyne? Yeah, Burgoyne. I keep screwing up his last name. General Burgoyne moved to recapture Fort Ticonderoga, which he did on July 7th. But Howe was supposed to be reinforcements. However, Fort Ticonderoga is to the north, and Philadelphia is to the south. And Howe is already dead set on taking Philadelphia, so he's heading south. And Burgoyne's sitting there at Fort Ticonderoga waiting on Howe. So Howe kept moving, captured Philadelphia in September. Meanwhile, General Barry St. Ledger, who was also supposed to support Burgoyne, was just making his way across New York State. Joseph Brant and his sister Molly, who was also a Mohawk leader, were also gathering native forces. They were just wandering across New York State, not heading towards Fort Ticonderoga. So General Burgoyne was just up there with his troops in the fort, not able to leave because nobody's there helping him. So at Orskany, there were German-American farmers led by General Nicholas Herkimer, held off British forces and allowed for General Benedict Arnold to get to Fort Stanwix along with reinforcements and push the British back to Canada, which culminated in the Battle of Saratoga. This is an extremely important battle. In fact, this is what I'm going to call the turning point battle in the on the test. Battle of Saratoga was General Burgoyne by himself versus the Green Mountain Boys, Horatio Gates, Benedict Arnold, and the Oneida Allies. Now, while there were a lot of people involved, Benedict Arnold was the one largely leading the Battle of Saratoga.
I'll die quieter next time.
Please don't die.
I don't know what happened.
Drink water, not coffee.
I drink a lot of water, except for today. I'm not drinking this stuff. I'll die.
The actual battle happened at Freeman's Farm. Burgoyne's forces suffered double the casualties of the Continentals. And despite Howe having taken Philadelphia, The battle was so crushing for the British that it was a major morale boost for the Continentals, which is to say the Americans, and kept them fighting. And as we're going to see, not today because we're getting close to the end, but I'm going to try to get a little further. It's going to be extremely important for getting allies for the Americans. So here we have Howe heading down to Philadelphia. Burgoyne up there at Fort Ticonderoga. St. Ledger just sort of out in the middle of New York State. I think Clinton was stopped. Actually, it's there. Yeah. Oh, it doesn't mention Clinton. Okay. Clinton didn't get far enough north. Yeah, see, there's Gates, got up to Saratoga along with Benedict Arnold. And there's Herkimer stopped St. Ledger there at Orskany, so that they wouldn't be able to reinforce Saratoga, so that Gates and Arnold could work together to just wipe the floor with Burgoyne. Anyway, here's a bunch of British dramatically dying. You know, I usually say on this one, I'd hate to be drafted to the British Army and they hand you a drum. It's like, here, go be loud. But I'd actually hate it more to be told, hey, take this 10-foot tall flag and be the biggest target on the battlefield. That would be worse. I know both are for morale purposes, but let me shoot back. Even if, I know the muskets are inaccurate as hell, but let me at least feel like I'm doing something. Anyway, here's after Saratoga. All right. Actually, I will continue this next one next time because it goes really well with the following one. So we will not be finishing this on Wednesday, but we will probably be finishing it next Monday and reviewing and test Wednesday. So just remember, papers on Wednesday, please. Gonna mute you guys. Okay, I think that's all I've got. Just send your papers in on Wednesday. I'm gonna have a lot of papers because I'm gonna have papers from like everybody. So I don't know how long that'll take me to grade. Um, but I'll work on it. So yeah, send those in. I know at least one of you asked about bringing it in physically. Um, you're welcome to do that. I'll be here Mondays and Wednesdays, like 8:30 to 11:15, and then Tuesday, Thursday, 9:30. When's the class start? Oh, it was 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock ish, 9:45 to 11:15. I'm in 511 and 509, which are right next to each other. And you can also just turn them into the front office and I'll pick them up on the way out. If you want to bring them in physically, you don't have to. I'll just put the grades up. I usually hand them back, but since you're not here, then I can't. But yeah. So yeah, that's all I got. I'll talk to y'all on Wednesday, I guess. So yeah, bye.